Okay, now that we have our creature set down into the environment, we have the feet where we want them, and we have them behind certain texture fills that are already there, and we've messed with the levels, and we've messed with the color balance. Now we're going to do what's called dodging and burning in order to really get the lighting to make sense. So on my creature, the kind of special effect lighting is his glowing lava in there. And I'm going to leave that for now, and then I'm going to add some smoke and some steam. But then I don't really love how his beak is so saturated in this environment. So the first thing I'm going to do is on my creature layer, I'm going to lasso around his head in general. And instead of editing my creature directly, I'm going to make a duplicate of that. And then I'm going to dodge and burn on that. So the first thing I'll do is just burn it down a little bit, especially in the midtones. An exposure less than 30. I'm just going to darken some of the midtones of the head. Now it's going to look subtle because we're seeing it underneath this texture fill. And then I'm going to sponge it and desaturate some of this bright, bright color. I expect that to have a little bit more effect, but the computer has to catch up with me a little. And it's a slow, controllable process. You can also, because I made the selection, I can also just go to hue saturation and just desaturate, let's say, the yellows right from there. Kind of push those back. I can even darken them a little bit. Just the yellows. So, big difference there in the head. So it doesn't stand out quite so much. Now the reason I did it on a separate layer is if I want it to stand out a little bit more, I can always take the opacity down on that layer. If I want the eye to show up a little bit more, I can always erase away. Around that, and I could erase away at a lower opacity so I have more control. So you're doing really just whatever's best for the believability. Okay, so there's the head. Now, what else can I dodge and burn? Well, this hand, I want this to be a little bit darker overall. So I'm going to go back to my creature layer. I'm going to select this arm just in general. I don't need to be a very good selection because I already have it cut out just how I want it. Make a duplicate of that, just that arm. And let's burn it just by darkening its midtones. Okay? And especially limiting its highlights. So it shows up a little bit more on that white background. So big difference there. A lot stronger. It's kind of cutting through the fog a little bit now. I can also use dodge and burn. So I'm going to burn some of the midtones, especially the edge. Okay. And then where it looks odd, I'm going to blend that in with that soft eraser at the edges of my selections. I can also use levels to limit the darks, which are maybe a little too strong on some parts of this. So if I go to adjustment levels, just like I limited the highlights, I can limit the darks. I can narrow this value range a little bit. I can also dodge out some of those shadows, which I don't usually recommend. I say always do the highlights, or always leave the highlights and shadows alone and just dodge and burn on the midtones. But when something's so dark like the edges of this hand, what I was thinking of is kind of fingernails and details, sometimes dodging shadows makes a lot of sense. Okay, and of course, I can always merge together. I'll select those 3 layers that I've just done. I'm going to hit Command E, and what that does is it merges those selected layers all into one so that I can then gently erase away from them. And what's nice is when you erase in an environment, you're actually letting the environment come through, so you don't need to worry about it being not 100% opaque. So I'm using that soft, low opacity eraser and just kind of massaging those edges in a way that makes more sense. All right, that looks a lot better. Now, if there's something I want above the texture, so for instance, this is without the texture fills, pretty dramatic, but the texture fills really kind of knock him back. I can always erase away from some of the texture fills. So for the hand, I'm going to use this soft brush at a very low opacity, soft eraser, and I want to get some of these shadows back. So this is another way we can kind of burn our character just by getting rid of some of the texture fill, depending on how you used it. But in most cases, that texture fill is very helpful. So don't be too anxious to get rid of it. And now I feel like I could dodge the midtones on the top of the arm a little bit, and that won't be misplaced. Okay, now some special effects. Some texture around the feet. Notice there isn't much. Well, instead of going and finding more texture, though I certainly can, another texture fill, I can use what's available. So I can steal it from some of these textures I already have. So I'm going to go on this snow layer. I'm going to make a soft kind of selection of that texture, like so. Duplicate it a lot so I see what I have. All right, so a lot of mist. Then I'm going to combine all those layer 12 copies, select them all, Command E, merge them together. So now this is its own layer I can play with using the Move tool. And I want to put it as a kind of a cloud around the feet, but I want to transform it so it looks like it's actually coming from the feet. So I'm going to control click in there and I'm going to warp it. I'm going to change its shape to kind of look like he's just kicking up this dust in front of him. And it's kind of spreading all around. So it's exploding out from his feet like that. Now, of course, that hard edge doesn't work, so I'm going to use my soft eraser and really knock those edges back. A higher opacity for more speed, a lower opacity for more control. So the closer I get to the feet, the lower opacity I'm going to make this eraser and really kind of control the shape of this cloud. And I decide kind of what peeks through. Again, we tend to overdo it, so I always put it on its own layer so I can take its opacity down to see what I've done. So that's with nothing, that's with everything. This is somewhere in between. That helps a lot. I can also just move it as its own layer. where I think it's best suited. And I can stretch it. And I can continue to warp it. So all the same skills, just used for a slightly different purpose. And I still have this little piece of snow here. I'm going to use this for breath. And so what I'm going to do is, again, duplicate it a lot. Actually, I'll make it 100% opacity. Maybe duplicate it a few times so it's really easy to see. So take all those layer 12s, merge them together now. Warp them into something that looks like breath coming from, oops, didn't want all the layer 12s. Can always go back in your history, remember? Before I merged, I don't want the feet caught up with the breath. So now I'll take these two layers, merge those together. Let's see. Maybe it's just one layer. Okay, so it's not copy B, it's the 12 and the copy here. There we go. Merge those two together. This is going to be the breath. If you get confused in your layers, we have a lot now, it's a good practice to double click on them and label them sometimes. So I'll call that breath. Okay, now just really quickly before this demo runs out, I'm going to add this special effect. I'm going to warp it, make it look like breath coming out of his nose and mouth. Kind of vapor extending up. Maybe like that. Okay, and now I'm going to use that eraser and cut away those hard edges and blend it in. And because it's its own layer, I can keep modifying it. I can kind of move it up a little bit. I can widen it at the top. Kind of push and pull it like pizza dough coming out of his nose. And just make sure you get all those hard edges off. Gonna go really low opacity. Just hit it a few times. Okay, and now I can take the whole thing and decide how much I actually want of that breath coming from his nostrils. Makes quite a difference. So it's all a matter of subtlety here. Okay, next, if I decide something's a little too sharp, like maybe that corner of him, I just erase from these different texture fills and let him show up a little bit. Where do I want the texture to show? And of course, if I want more texture anywhere, I can just duplicate a selection, move it, transform it, work with it, and that will just give me more presence.